Hi, my name is Michael Wilde, we're inside of Mari 4.5, and this is an avocado. Why an avocado? Great question. So we're going to be looking at nodes a bit more in depth today, and what they do, why they're useful, why I think they're better than layers. We're going to go through it all. If you've never used them before, this is a great video to get you started. So I've got this project, it's got all the default settings, I've created all the default channels. If you open up your node graph first and foremost, to do that, you're going to go to this subpalette menu here and either click Node Graph if you're using Mari 4 or Mari 4.5. If you're using a slightly older version, you can open it by going View, Palettes, Node Graph here. So if we have a look at this, we've got our node graph here, and on the right, we've got this node properties box here. So this looks a little bit confusing already, not really sure what we're looking at. So that's just because Mari hasn't really laid everything out super cleanly to begin with. So to start off, let's just lay things out. We can do it by hand by clicking nodes and dragging them, or you can press L on your keyboard to auto-place everything. So I'm going to do that. Auto-place, cool. So it's not perfect. I'm going to move things a little bit just because it makes me slightly OCD. Cool. So what are we looking at? Great question. So on the left, we've got these bottom transparency and paint nodes, all on the left-hand side. We've then got these blue base nodes. And then we've got these ones called base color, specular, roughness, bump. They're all kind of plugged into this principal BRDF, and that's plugged into this viewer one. So it's, first and foremost, it's good to kind of look at how these arrows are going from the left to the right. So that's how we read our node tree. So yeah, let's just kind of break everything down. So if we look at our channels palette, which I've handily got preloaded, you can see that the channels that Mari has created for us are actually also listed inside of the node graph. So I've got this base color, I've got bump, roughness, and specular. They're all here. They're plugged into this shader here. So all these are nodes that are representing our channels. And then so this shader here is, if I go just to the shading palette now, shaders, you can see that this principal BRDF is the same as this one here. So the node graph is really handy in that respect because it kind of just groups everything that's going on in different subpalettes. So if I head over to my layers palette now, so I'm inside of the base color, we've got this base layer. If I click that, then we've got this base node, which represents exactly the same thing. The slight difference being, though, that these two nodes that are being pumped into this base layer, up here, base node here, cannot be represented inside of the layer node because we can only get as small as this base layer. So these two, so what are they? So to view a node, the easiest way to see things is to view them. So we've got this viewer node, much like in Nuke. If I press 1 on my keyboard on something, it will show me a visual representation of what I've pressed 1 on. And that's now it's now connected to this viewer. If I press 2, then that is now the keyboard shortcut of 2. So if I press 1 and 2, I can switch between viewing these two nodes. So on 1, we've got this bottom transparency, which does as it says. It's just an empty lot of data. There's no data here. It's just transparent. Then if I press 2, this paint node here is just filled with grey. Nothing in it but grey. And they're both going into this base node. So this base node, this blue one, is actually a merge node. We're going to talk a little bit about that later, but if I double click that, we've got some options. That's how you look at the options of a node. You just double click it. So this paint node here, I can double click that. And this bottom transparency, I can double click that. And that just shows me the options for their nodes. So let's start off by creating a new node. What are we going to create? Well, let's just create something really simple. Let's create just a fill color. So to create a node, you can either right click or you can use tab. I'm going to use tab to begin with. So if I press tab and just type in color, it's got the American spelling. And if I double click that now, I'm going to press 1 to view it. You can see we've got this pure white node. So I can change the color by double click on that, get the node properties up, click on this color. Let's say, for example, I wanted it to be, I'm just going to slide this along to this horrible neon green. And I'm going to click on the OK on that. So now this color node is just a fill color of this green. So how do I get this green into my base color? Great question. So what we're going to need to do is we're going to need to merge it in. So I'm going to move everything along a little bit here, just to give me a bit more space. And we're going to be focusing mainly on the base color here. And so I want to get this green color onto my badly modeled avocado. So to do that, we're going to need to merge it in. So to make a merge node, you can type in merge by pressing tab, and that brings up the options. So here, this makes a merge node, which looks exactly the same as this base node, which tells us that this base node is a merge node that's just been renamed. Or you can press M on your keyboard to create one. That's just the shortcut. So I'm going to delete that now. So what does a merge node do? So a merge node is really simple. It takes in whatever is in the base, and it merges whatever goes into over on top of that base. You've also got this third slot, which can mask off certain bits. We're going to talk about that more later. So if I want to, so at the moment, if I view this merge node, you can see it's just grey. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to plug this merge node into our node tree. So when it goes yellow, that tells me that if I let go of clicking, then it's going to pop it in. So if I view this now, it's exactly the same. But if I merge over this green color, then it applies this green color on top of everything because it's merging it on top. So much like with layers, you can change the blend mode. So if I double click this merge node, I can change it to anything. So say, for example, I want to set it to darken. I want to set it to multiply. I can do that. So that adds only the dark value, or I can set it to lighten add. And that changes it differently as well. I'm going to set it to normal for now, but that's just to be aware. And then you can also set the amount that it merges on top. So say, for example, I want it to just be 50%. I can get rid of this and do 0.5. And now it's merging 50% of this grey, 50% of this green, sorry, on top of this grey. I'm going to set that back to 1. And that's how merge nodes work. So you can get quite complex scenes because anytime you're adding new details in, you're usually merging it on top. So these node trees can get quite long, but more on that later on, how to kind of organize things. So for now, we've got this green on this avocado. But let's say, for example, I only wanted it on bits of it. So I'm going to go back and view my principal BRDF now, and that's going to show me it in shaded view. And you can see I've got this green color now coming into my base color. But say, for example, I only want it on the fleshy bit of the avocado and not on the pip. So that's where this little mask section on the merge node comes in handy. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a black and white layer to, So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use a black and white node to inform it where to merge this green on top. So what I could do that in a number of ways, but to show off another feature, I'm going to drop down a paint node. So paint nodes are what we've got here. So a paint node is really similar to adding a new layer. If I go paint now, so this is a node that I can hand paint details into, I can project into. So yeah, it's a really handy one and you will be using a lot in nodes. So I'm going to click just paint now. You can also press P on your keyboard for a shortcut to create one. So what it's going to ask me is it's going to ask me a few things. First and foremost, it's going to ask me the resolution, then it's going to ask me the bit depth and a few other options. So one thing to take note of inside of nodes, a really handy feature, is that you can set different paint nodes to different size. So when you're using layers, everything in one UDIM will be set to the size of that UDIM. So for example, if you're using 4K patches, 8K patches, everything has to be 4K. Whereas when you're using nodes, you can set some to less or more, meaning that you can really optimize the way that your scene works, and it can just it can make your scene run a lot quicker by having some things that don't need to be as heavily detailed, lower resolution. So for this mask, for example, I know it's going to be filled with just black and white because I'm not going to be adding any nice texture detail to it. So I can keep it to 1K for now, and it shouldn't really affect the output. I'm going to keep the bit depth at 16. Here I could change the color that it is created with. I want it to be black for now, so this is fine. But say, for example, I wanted it to be flush with white, then I can set that to white, and I can also change the transparency of it. So if I wanted it to be just a clean node with nothing in it, then I can set the transparency, the alpha there. So I'm going to click OK, and that's going to create this new paint node for me. So if I view this now by pressing 1, you can see that I've got this brand new black node. So if I plug this in now into my merge node, into the mask, to plug something in, you can click off the output and then bring it into the mask. Now I'm going to view this merge node, and you can see that because it's black, it's adding none of this green anywhere. If I were to disable this mask by pressing D on the node, then that means there's no mask any longer and green goes everywhere. I'm going to press D to re-enable it. So if I view this now, I'm going to go to my selection tool and select the pip. I need to change it to, I'm going to change it to face mode. I'm going to select connected UVs because I know they are connected, and just select everything on this pip. I'm going to switch to just auto and UV to show off a little bit easier what I'm doing. So I know that these are the UVs for the pip, and I'm just going to paint this. So this, sorry, no, I got it wrong. I need to keep this black because I want this to be, I don't want this to be green, I want the rest to be white. So I was selecting the wrong bit. So I'm going to select these parts here and this stem as well, why not? I'm going to select my paintbrush tool, make sure it's set to white, which it is now, and I'm just going to really quickly, made a mistake there, haven't I? Because I haven't got it select to. So I'm going to change the way it projects on, because I was painting and it was doing on everything, but I want it to just be on selected. So now it's going to paint on just those bits that I selected. So now we have a black and white mask. I have pressed Alt to bake that down. Or you can press B. Alt just moves the camera, and I've got it to auto bake and clear on moving the camera, which is why it does that. So yeah, now I've got this mask, which is black on the pip like I want it, and white everywhere else. So if I now view this merge node, you will see it has got green everywhere else, and it's got grey on this pip. So that is a really awful colour now that I come to think about it. So I'm going to double click on that node and just change this to something slightly more avocado-y, a little bit more desaturated. So yeah, I'm going to click off that now to see. So that's a little bit better. So that's how a merge node works. So I have merged this green colour on top of what was going on in my node tree already, and used a mask to tell it and inform it where I want that to happen. So I'm actually going to rename this node because Paint 4 isn't a great name. So I'm going to double click it, and up the top you can see where it says Paint 4. I'm going to select this to avo mask _ mask. And then this one here, this green color, I'm going to just set this to avo color. So that's how to use the merge node inside of the node graph. Obviously we can do a lot more complex things than this. So what we're going to do is we're going to build this up slightly. I'm just going to add another one. So I'm going to do a merge node by pressing M again. I'm going to drop that down. And just to add some really quick kind of procedural detail, I'm going to add a Perlin noise. So I'm going to type in P, Perlin. Double click on it. I'm going to view this, and you can see it's just got a bit of change there. I'm going to change the size on that by double clicking it, change the properties. And now if I plug this into the over, let's have a look at that. If I press 1 on that now, you can see that it has merged it fully on top. But what I'm going to do is now I'm going to change the blend mode of this. Instead of normal, I'm going to set this to, let's go for multiply. So where it's dark, it's only going to add the dark detail and it's going to leave the white. So now you can see it's done that. So that's just making it a little bit more detailed than we had before. And what I can do now is, say for example, I didn't want this to be on the pip. I can use the same Avo mask that I've got here, and I can click off the output and drop this into the mask section here. So this is one of the most powerful things I think with nodes, is that you can share nodes that you've created across your node graph, and it just means that things are cleaner and they're also more well optimized. You can do this in layers. It just gets a bit more complicated seeing where everything is connected if you're using layer linking. But if I zoom out now, I can easily see that this mask here connects into 2 places. So it's just a really nice way to kind of keep things a bit cleaner and optimized. And this is one of the most powerful things I think about the node graph, is just visually being able to see where things link up and being able to use things multiple times. So now we've got that. Let's say, for example, I wanted to add a new channel. How would I do that? So obviously I can go up to the channels here and create a new one the normal way. But let's say, for example, I wanted to create a new one, and let's say I wanted to create a new metallic channel, because I knew my shader was going to need that. So I can press tab again, and if I type in channel now, I can create a new channel. So this is going to give me the normal UI that I would get when I create one with the channels palette. I'm going to set the name to metallic. I'm going to set the size to 4K. Bit depth is good for me. I know I want it to be raw data because it's going to be metallic. I'm not going to go too much into color space here because that's a whole topic on itself. And I'm going to click OK on that. And now you can see I've got this new metallic node. So my metallic, I want it to be black. By default, if I view this, it seems to have set it to that. But just to make sure, what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a color by pressing tab on the keyboard. I'm going to click and view that. So if I view that, you can see it's white. There's no metallicity on an avocado, so I'm going to change that to black now, and I'm just going to plug that in. And then also, I can now drag this into my shader, the output of that, into this BRDF shader, just to get a better view of what's going on. So that's how you create a channel inside the node graph. So the node graph is great because you can also do all the things that you can do inside the layer graph. So say, for example, this, I wanted to add a procedural. I've done that so far with the Perlin, but let's say I wanted to, add a adjustment. So say the saturation on this wasn't looking great, then I can press tab. If I press tab on a node that's already selected, then whatever it creates will be created afterwards. So if I press tab on this and type in HSV, which is a node I use a lot, hue saturation value, press enter on that, it's going to create it afterwards. So now if I view this node, double click it, I can change the saturation, or I can change the hue. So I'm going to reset this by clicking this button here, and I'm just going to make it a slight bit of yellow to it, maybe saturate it up. So that's looking slightly better to me. So that's how you add an adjustment layer. So I can add quite a few of those. So say, for example, I also wanted to do a contrast after that. I can do that, press enter. There wasn't enough space for it to create it there by default. So what it's done is it's moved it over there. So I'm just going to do that. And then I'm going to drag everything along just to give myself a bit more space. It's really important to keep things organized in the node graph because your scenes can get quite complex quite quickly. So if I press 1 on that, view it, and then double click it to open up the node properties, I can then play with that. I don't want to set it too contrasty. You know what, actually, I'm going to bring it down. So I'm going to just set it to 0.8 to bring my contrast down ever so slightly, and I can change that pivot just to tell it where exactly it is doing that contrast. So I can press D on that node to disable it to show me the difference before and after. So yeah, let's just brought the contrast down. So yeah, say for example, I'm quite happy with that. That looks good. Cool. So what other features can we look at? So one thing is organizationally, if you want to keep, because this is a very visual way to work, if you've got a really heavy node graph with a lot going on, it can be quite hard to keep track of what's going on. So for now, I've got everything fairly nicely organized. I know, for example, my base color is all on the top and my other channels are underneath. But what I can do is I can set up backdrops. Again, I think it's a feature in Nuke. So if I type in backdrop, it just brings up this kind of almost like, I think of it as a post-it note kind of thing, where it just gives you a color in the background. So if I change this, say, to something a bit brighter, and then if I change the name, so let's call this masks, for example. So if I zoom out now, when I zoom out, I can see that anything inside of here is a mask. So this avocado mask that I was using for the pip, I can drag this into here. And what I often do actually is I create a little backdrop just for all my masks and keep that to one side, so that I know if I want to find and change a mask, I can just zoom out and then head over here to my mask backdrop. And then, so all of these nodes I know are for my base color. So if I select all of them and then type in backdrop, it's going to add a backdrop to that. So I can change a color for that just to make it a bit more identifiable. That's a bit too saturated. Let's bring that down. Something like that. And then I can call this color. And now when I zoom out, some weirdness going on there, but I know instantly where all the nodes for my base color are. So I think that's a really handy feature just to keep things organized. So the final thing we'll touch on really briefly, I'm not going to go into too much detail because I think it deserves a video of its own, is the new materials in 4.5. So say for example you wanted to create your own material, you can press tab and then type in material. And that's going to ask me what kind of shader I want. I'm going to select principled BRDF by default, and I'm just going to click OK on that. So you can't do this in the layer palette or the channel palette. There's no way to create your own material. If you go over to the shelf, you can use a predefined one. So I could drag this into the layers and it would create it, but there's no way to make your own one from scratch. You have to do it inside the node graph. So to do that, again, I'm not going to go into too much detail, but you can press shift and double click on is it control? It's control. I lied. You can control and double click and that will jump into this material node, and then you can set up the material from inside of there. And then anything that you've set up inside that material will come out of the base, come out of the metallic, come out of the, this that looks like subsurface. And then say, for example, you wanted to merge two materials together. If I type in multi-merge, I can then click that. It's going to ask me which shader model because I've created BRDF. I'm going to use that. And then what that does is this is just a merge node, but for two materials. So if I create another material now, they're empty, so they're not going to actually add anything. But then I can drag this on, and it's going to hook up all of this material to this multi-merge node. I'm going to drag this material here, and now we're merging these two materials on top, exactly like we're doing with these merge nodes. We've got a base and an over, and here we've got base and over, and at the bottom we've got mask as well. And then that's going to give me one output that's merged, and I can double click that, and you can also change the blend modes and the opacity of different channels as well. So I'm not going to go into how to create a material. If you'd like that, then please maybe leave a comment below asking about that. It's something that will take its own lesson, and I think this is already overrunning. But I just think that's a good way. It's a good thing to know because there isn't a huge amount of documentation yet on Mari materials as it's so new. But that's another node that you can create inside the node graph, and you will often be working with the node graph if you're using materials because it's a more in-depth way to work. Let's just talk about what nodes bring to the table that other things don't. So I've got this color now made. So say, for example, this was a beautiful base color that I'd hand painted and it was perfect and it was ready to be rendered. The beauty of this is because these nodes, because it's a non-destructive workflow, I can just take this data here and I can plug it into my other channels. So say, for example, I wanted to use this base color as my specular. So I know my specular needs to be black and white, so I can just add another HSV here. Drag this in here. Double click my HSV. I'm going to view that and then bring the saturation down. And then I can just plug this into my specular. And straight away, I've already got some information ready to go. So with channels, obviously, I could copy and paste it over, but because none of this is baked down, really, apart from the one node that I've painted, this one paint node, it's this one here, this one mask, it's really easy to work procedurally, and all I need to do is just update my masks, and the rest of it will kind of update, and not only is it going to update my base color, but it's also going to update my specular, my roughness, my bump, and my metallic. When you do start getting heavier scenes as well, Mari's got some really handy features just to keep things a little bit lighter for you. So if I press tab and create a bake point, so what this is going to ask, it's going to ask my size that I want, it's going to ask the bit depth that I want, and the file space. Again, I'm going to ignore the file space. I'm going to untick raw data because I'm using this for my base color. I'm going to keep it to 4K and 16-bit, and it doesn't really matter about the color here. So what the bake point does is if I drop this in, it's kind of similar to layer caching. Anything up until this point, if I double click this and were to hit bake, anything up until this point would be baked into this one paint node. It would mean that Mari no longer needs to calculate anything downstream from it. So if you've got a really, really heavy node tree going on before, and say, for example, you're about to export something or you want to view something a bit quicker in the viewport because Mari does get quite clunky, you can use this bake point, you can bake it. So if I click that now, and whilst it calculates, you can now see it's green, so this bake point is up to date, and I can view that, and this is an up-to-date, so this is an up-to-date bake of everything going before. So now if I were to change, say for example I change this contrast node, you can see that this bake point should turn red because it's now out of date. So that tells me that if I double click this now and bake it again, it will update any changes that I've made downstream. So that's just a handy thing to know. I think it's a really good tool for optimization. I've used it a lot at work when I'm using really, really heavy scenes and Mari is just chugging, but I know that, say for example, everything in one backdrop isn't going to change. Then I can just bake anything, I can put a bake point at the end of that and then start adding things on top of that bake point just to speed it up. So I can use a lot of these. So if you do have multiple, so say for example, I'm just going to add another. I'm just going to add this down the end here. So now if I were to bake this one, so this is up to date. So if I knew that these weren't going to change, if there was a lot of nodes before this bake point, then I can leave that one there, and then I can just play around with these nodes. And now if I right click and go to nodes, if I go to edit bake points and just smart bake and update, it's going to update any bake nodes that are out of date in my scene. So now this one has been updated. And I can also, there were some other options there. If I go to edit bake points, so I can update selected, update downstream, and also just bake the selected ones without having to go into the node properties. So that was quite an in-depth look at nodes inside of Mari. If you've got any other questions, please feel free to leave them below. I will take the time to answer them. If you've got any more videos that you would like to see, whether it be Mari, Substance, Maya, I do know quite a few pieces of software and I do plan to make some more. You can head over to my website, which is michaelwilde.co.uk, for updates. There's a mailing list there to be first to know when new ones come out, or you can subscribe. And let me know if this has helped, if you've got any other questions. But for now, take it easy and best of luck texturing. Cheers.